"You're not on the guest list, ma'am," the young man in the black suit said, his voice polite but firm, as if he had practiced that sentence all morning without ever expecting to use it on someone like me. I stood there for a moment, just outside the white floral arch that marked the entrance to my son's wedding venue, the spring air brushing softly against my face, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, the kind of day I had once imagined would be perfect for Daniel, the kind of day I had spent months quietly preparing for in my own way, choosing a navy blue dress he once told me made me look elegant. Wrapping a gift I had picked with care, something meaningful, something lasting. Something a mother gives when she believes she is still part of her son's life. I smiled at the young man, not because I found anything amusing, but because at 68, you learn that dignity often sounds like silence and looks like a gentle smile. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice calm, steady, the same voice that had soothed fevers, calmed nightmares, and once told a little boy that everything would always be okay. He checked his tablet again, scrolling slowly, his brow tightening just slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I've checked twice. There's no Margaret Collins on the list." Behind him, I could see guests arriving, women in pastel dresses, men adjusting their ties, laughter floating freely as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong on a day like this. I recognized a few faces, neighbors, old friends, people who had once sat at my dining table during holidays, now walking past me with polite nods, their eyes lingering just a second too long, sensing something was off but not wanting to be part of it. And then I saw him. Daniel. My son. Standing just inside the entrance, his hand resting lightly at the small of his bride's back, Sophie in a flowing ivory gown that caught the sunlight like something out of a magazine. He looked different somehow, not older, not tired, just distant, like someone who had already made a decision and had no intention of revisiting it. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I waited for the flicker of recognition, the instinctive reaction a son has when he sees his mother in an unexpected place. But instead, he hesitated, then leaned slightly towards Sophie as if asking a silent question. She didn't look at me right away. She simply adjusted the strap of her dress, her expression composed, almost serene, and then finally turned her gaze toward me, her eyes cool, measured, already certain of the outcome. She said something to Daniel, something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I had seen that look before. Not once. Not twice. Many times, in smaller moments, in subtle exclusions, in decisions made without me, around me, over me. The young man at the entrance shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am, if you could please step aside, we have other guests arriving." I nodded gently and took a small step back, the gravel beneath my shoes crunching softly, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. I glanced down at the invitation in my hand, the one that had arrived 3 weeks ago, my name printed neatly beside Daniel's, the ink still crisp, still official, still real. For a second, I considered showing it to him, insisting, demanding an explanation, reminding everyone exactly who I was. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Daniel had looked at me, or maybe it was the quiet certainty settling in my chest, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from understanding. I folded the invitation slowly and slipped it back into my purse. "It's all right," I said softly. "I must have gotten the date wrong." The young man looked relieved, almost grateful that I wasn't going to make this harder than it already was. I turned away from the entrance, from the music that had just started playing, from the life that was moving forward without me, and began walking toward the parking lot. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if I were placing pieces into a puzzle I hadn't fully seen yet. They thought this was the end of something. A quiet removal. A gentle erasure. But as I reached my car and placed my hand on the door handle, I realized something they clearly hadn't. This wasn't the moment I was being excluded. This was the moment I was finally being shown the truth. Thomas did not speak immediately after I answered, and that silence told me more than any words could have, because it was the kind of silence that comes from someone who already understands there is a reason behind the call, someone who knows that people like me do not reach out without purpose. I could almost picture him on the other end, sitting at his desk with those neatly stacked folders, the same way he always had, his glasses resting low on his nose as he waited for me to continue. I looked down at my hands, steady now, no longer trembling the way they had earlier that morning, and realized that something inside me had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone watching, but in a way that mattered. "I need to review everything my husband put in place," I said finally, choosing my words carefully, not out of fear, but out of clarity. "All the documents. Every detail." There was a pause, brief but deliberate, as if he was confirming something in his mind before responding. "Of course," he said, his tone professional, but softer than usual. "Would you like me to come by, or would you prefer to meet at the office?" I glanced again toward the venue, where the distant sound of laughter rose and fell like a tide I was no longer part of, and for the first time, it did not pull at me the way it had before. "The office," I replied. "I will be there within the hour." I ended the call and placed the phone gently back into my purse, then started the engine, the quiet hum filling the small space around me as I eased the car out of the parking spot. As I drove away, the venue grew smaller in my rearview mirror, the white arch fading into the distance until it became just another shape on the horizon, something that no longer defined where I belong. The road ahead stretched clear and open, lined with early spring trees just beginning to bloom, their branches carrying the promise of something new, something that had not yet been shaped or decided. My mind moved through memories again, but differently this time, not as something to hold on to, but as something to examine. I remembered the day my husband first insisted on putting certain legal structures in place, how he had sat across from Thomas with a seriousness that I had not fully understood at the time, explaining that protection was not about distrust, but about responsibility. I had laughed softly back then, telling him that Daniel would never need to be protected from his own family, that love would be enough to keep everything in balance. He had smiled at me in that patient way of his, the kind that suggested he knew something I did not, but hoped I would never have to learn. As the miles passed beneath my tires, I began to understand what he had meant, not as a painful realization, but as a clear one, like seeing the final piece of a puzzle slide into place after years of not knowing what the full picture looked like. When I arrived at the office building, I parked in the same spot I had used countless times before, the familiarity of it grounding me in a way that felt almost comforting. The building itself had not changed, the brick exterior steady and unchanged, the glass doors reflecting the afternoon light as I stepped out of the car and made my way inside. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, recognizing me immediately, and within minutes, I was seated across from Thomas in his office, the same room where so many decisions had once been discussed quietly and without urgency. He slid a folder across the desk toward me, thicker than I expected, its edges worn slightly from time, but still intact, still waiting. "Your husband was very thorough," he said gently, folding his hands in front of him. "He wanted to make sure that everything remained exactly as he intended, regardless of circumstances." I placed my hand on the folder but did not open it right away, feeling the weight of it beneath my fingers, not as a burden, but as something solid, something real. "Then it is time I finally understand exactly what he intended," I said, my voice calm, steady, and certain in a way that left no room for doubt, not from him, and not from myself. I opened the folder slowly, not with hesitation, but with a kind of deliberate care, as if I already understood that whatever was inside would not shock me, only confirm what had been quietly unfolding for years without my full awareness. The papers inside were neatly organized, each section tabbed, each document dated and signed with a precision that reflected the man my husband had always been, thoughtful, methodical, and quietly protective in ways that did not always announce themselves until they were needed most. Thomas remained silent as I began to read, giving me the space to absorb each line at my own pace, and I appreciated that more than I could say. The first few pages outlined the structure of our estate, familiar details that I had once skimmed through without much concern, trusting that everything would naturally pass to Daniel in time, just as most people expect. But as I continued, the language shifted, becoming more specific, more conditional, and I felt my attention sharpen with each sentence. There were clauses, carefully written, outlining how assets were to be managed, not transferred outright, but held within a trust, with clear conditions tied to behavior, to respect, to ongoing connection. I paused, my eyes lingering on a paragraph that seemed to stand apart from the rest, its wording precise but unmistakable in its intent. Any beneficiary who demonstrated neglect, coercion, or intentional exclusion toward the primary holder of the estate would forfeit access to distributions until such behavior was corrected and verified over time. I read the sentence twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I was finally allowing myself to fully take it in. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair. Your husband believed that relationships reveal themselves most clearly under pressure, he said quietly. He wanted to ensure that you would never be placed in a position where your well-being depended on someone who did not treat you with respect. I closed the folder halfway, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, and for a moment, I could see my husband sitting across from me again, his expression calm, his voice steady, explaining something I had once thought unnecessary. Back then, I had believed that love would always be enough to guide people to do the right thing, that family bonds were naturally self-correcting, that misunderstandings would resolve themselves without needing structure or consequence. But what I was holding in my hands now was not a sign of distrust. It was a recognition of reality, one that I had been slow to accept. Does Daniel know about this? I asked, my voice even, without accusation or emotion, just a simple question that needed a clear answer. Thomas shook his head slightly. He was informed of the general structure, but not the specific enforcement conditions. Your husband felt it was better that those remain dormant unless they became necessary. Necessary. The word settled into the room with a quiet weight. I thought about the morning, about the moment at the entrance, about the look on Daniel's face, the certainty in Sophie's eyes, the way the decision to exclude me had already been finalized long before I ever arrived. It had not been impulsive. It had not been emotional. It had been planned. I opened the folder again and continued reading, moving through pages that outlined not only financial protections, but also decision-making authority, access controls, and the clear designation that as long as I was alive and mentally competent, no major asset could be transferred, sold, or restructured without my direct approval. Every line reinforced the same truth in a different way. I had not been left vulnerable. I had simply been unaware of the strength that had been placed in my hands. When I finally looked up, Thomas was watching me carefully, not with concern, but with a kind of quiet respect, as if he understood that this was not a moment of distress, but of recognition. What would you like to do? He asked. I closed the folder fully this time and placed both hands on top of it, steady and certain, the same way I had once held Daniel's small hands when he needed reassurance, when he needed guidance, when he trusted me to lead. For now, I said calmly, meeting Thomas's gaze without hesitation. We do exactly what my husband intended. Thomas gave a slight nod, as if he had been expecting that answer all along, and reached for a pen, making a few notes on a legal pad beside him with the same steady precision I remembered from years before, while I sat there with the folder still beneath my hands, feeling its weight not as something heavy, but as something anchoring, something that reminded me that not everything in my life had been as fragile as I once believed. There are a few steps we can take immediately, he said, his tone measured, careful, as though each word was being placed exactly where it needed to be. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to ensure that everything remains exactly as it should. I listened without interrupting, my mind clear, focused, not clouded by emotion the way it might have been even that morning. He explained that certain accounts could be reviewed, access permissions quietly verified, notifications set in place so that any attempt to move or adjust assets would require direct confirmation from me. It was not about confrontation. It was about awareness. It was about control. I found myself nodding slightly, understanding each point not just intellectually, but instinctively, as if something in me had been waiting for this moment to step forward, to take its place without hesitation. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at me with a question in his eyes that did not need to be spoken. I knew what he was asking. Whether I wanted to confront Daniel. Whether I wanted to address what had happened that morning directly. Whether I wanted to demand an explanation. I considered it for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be certain that my response came from the right place, not from hurt, not from pride, but from clarity. "No," I said quietly, my voice steady. "Not yet." Thomas did not seem surprised. In fact, there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that looked almost like approval. "Sometimes," he said gently, "it is better to let people show you who they are completely before you respond." I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I believe they already have," I replied, my tone calm, but firm in a way that did not invite disagreement. After a few more minutes of quiet discussion, we finalized the initial steps. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would disrupt anything immediately, just a series of quiet protections being put firmly into place, like locks being secured on doors that had been left open for far too long. When I finally stood to leave, I felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just more aligned, as if something inside me had settled into its proper position after years of being slightly off balance. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and for a brief moment, I stood there beside my car, taking in the stillness around me. The world had not changed. The sky was the same. The air felt the same. But I was not. I got into the car and started the engine again, but this time, there was no hesitation, no pause, no lingering attachment to where I had been earlier that day. As I drove home, my thoughts did not drift back to the ceremony, to the music, or to the moment I had been turned away. Instead, they moved forward calmly, deliberately, considering what came next, not as a reaction, but as a decision. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it that morning, quiet, familiar, unchanged, but as I stepped inside, I noticed something I had not allowed myself to fully see before. The silence was not empty. It was peaceful. I placed my purse on the table and walked slowly through each room, my fingers brushing lightly against the surfaces, the furniture, the photographs, each one holding a piece of a life I had built with care, with patience, with intention. This was my home. Not just in memory, not just in sentiment, but in truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I understood that clearly. I moved to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the simple action grounding me further, bringing me fully into the present moment. I did not need to rush. I did not need to prove anything. Everything that needed to happen would happen in time. And as I stood there, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, one thought settled firmly in my mind, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with certainty. They had made their move. Now I would make mine. The next morning arrived quietly, without ceremony, the kind of morning that does not announce itself but simply continues, as if nothing unusual had happened the day before, as if being turned away from your own son's wedding was just another small inconvenience, something easily forgotten by the world, even if it was not so easily set aside within. I woke at my usual time, the soft light of early spring filtering through the curtains, and for a moment, I lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant chirping of birds outside, everything steady, everything unchanged. And yet I did not feel the same. There was no heaviness pressing against my chest, no lingering confusion, no urge to replay the moment over and over again in search of a different outcome. Instead, there was clarity, quiet and precise, like a line drawn cleanly across a page. I moved through my morning routine without rushing, making coffee, setting a single cup on the table, the same way I had done for years, but this time, I noticed something different in the rhythm of it. There was no waiting. No expectation that someone else would join me. No silent hope that my phone might ring with an apology or an explanation. I had stopped expecting that sometime between stepping away from that entrance and walking into Thomas's office, and I knew now that it would not come. After breakfast, I carried the folder from the living room to the kitchen table and opened it again, not because I needed to reread every word, but because I wanted to understand it fully, to let each detail settle into place in a way that felt natural, not forced. I reviewed the sections Thomas had highlighted, the clauses that outlined the structure, the conditions, the safeguards that had been carefully woven into every aspect of what my husband had left behind. It was not just about money. It was about intention. It was about ensuring that respect remained a requirement, not an option. I paused at the same paragraph I had read the day before, the one that spoke about exclusion and neglect, about consequences tied not to emotions, but to actions, and I found myself reading it again, slower this time, allowing each word to land exactly where it needed to. When I finally closed the folder, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt prepared. The phone remained silent throughout the morning, resting on the counter where I had left it, its stillness almost deliberate, as if it too understood that whatever connection had once existed had shifted into something else entirely. Around mid-morning, I made a few calls, simple ones, quiet ones, confirming details with the bank, verifying information without drawing attention, just as Thomas had suggested. Each conversation was polite, straightforward, and ended with the same assurance that nothing had been changed, nothing had been moved, everything remained exactly as it should. And with each confirmation, the foundation beneath me felt stronger, more defined, no longer something I assumed, but something I knew. By the time the afternoon light began to stretch across the kitchen floor, I had finished everything I needed to do for the day, at least on the surface. But the real work, I realized, was not in the documents or the phone calls. It was in the decision I had already made, the one that did not require urgency or confrontation, the one that would unfold in its own time, guided not by emotion, but by truth. I stepped outside onto the back porch, the air warmer now, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from the garden my husband and I had planted years ago, and I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to reflect on what had been lost, but to acknowledge what remained. I was not waiting to be invited back into anything. I was not preparing to ask for explanations or apologies. I was simply allowing everything to reveal itself fully, without interference, without interruption. And somewhere deep within that quiet understanding, one thought settled firmly, not as a question, but as a certainty. They believed they had already taken something from me. What they did not yet understand was that they had only just begun to show me exactly what I needed to see. 2 days passed before the first message came, and even then, it was not what most people would expect. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened, no attempt to explain the silence that had followed. Instead, it was a simple text from Daniel, short and almost casual, as if he were reaching out after an ordinary weekend rather than after excluding his own mother from one of the most important days of his life. "Hope you are doing well. We just got back from the honeymoon resort. Talk soon." I read the message once, then again, not searching for hidden meaning, but recognizing the absence of it. There was no mention of the wedding. No recognition of my absence. No question asking where I had been or why I had not attended. It was as if the version of events they had chosen to believe did not include me at all. I set the phone down gently on the table and continued what I had been doing, organizing a drawer in the kitchen, placing items back into order with slow, deliberate movements. I did not feel the urge to respond immediately, and that alone told me how much had changed. In the past, I would have answered right away, careful with my words, eager to maintain connection, to avoid distance, to smooth over whatever discomfort might exist. But now, there was no urgency. The silence between us was no longer something I needed to fill. Later that afternoon, I drove to the bank, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to see everything for myself, to confirm what had already been explained, to ensure that my understanding was complete. The manager greeted me with polite familiarity, recognizing my name, my account, the history that had been built over decades, and as we sat across from each other in his office, reviewing statements and structures, everything aligned exactly as Thomas had said it would. Nothing had been altered. Nothing had been accessed without authorization. The safeguards were not theoretical. They were real, active, and firmly in place. When I left the bank, I did not feel relief. I felt confirmation. That evening, I returned home and found the house just as I had left it, quiet, steady, unchanged, and I moved through it with a sense of ownership that felt different from before, not because anything physical had shifted, but because my understanding of it had. I prepared dinner for myself, a simple meal, and sat at the table where I had once imagined family gatherings, where laughter used to fill the room, where conversations once flowed easily without effort. Now, there was only the soft clink of silverware against the plate, the quiet rhythm of a meal eaten alone, but it did not feel empty. It felt clear. After dinner, I picked up my phone again and opened Daniel's message, reading it one more time, not with hurt, not with disappointment, but with recognition. This was not an oversight. It was a choice. And choices, I had learned, carried consequences, whether people acknowledged them or not. I typed a response slowly, not rushed, not emotional, each word placed with intention. I am doing well. I hope your trip was enjoyable. Let me know when you are available to talk. There are a few important things we need to review. I read the message once before sending it, not to soften it, not to adjust it, but simply to confirm that it said exactly what I meant. Then I pressed send and set the phone aside, not waiting for a reply, not watching the screen, not anticipating his reaction. Whatever came next would come in its own time. I turned off the lights in the kitchen and stood for a moment in the quiet, the darkness settling gently around me, and I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting to what others had done. I was deciding what would happen next. And that difference, small as it might seem from the outside, changed everything. Daniel did not respond that night, and he did not respond the next morning either, but I was not surprised, because silence had already become a language he seemed comfortable using, a way of avoiding what he did not want to face directly. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion or hesitation. It was deliberate, controlled, the kind that assumes time will smooth things over without requiring any real accountability. I went about my day as usual, not checking my phone, not waiting for a notification, not adjusting my schedule around the possibility of a reply. Instead, I focused on what was already in motion, the quiet steps that had been set in place, the structure that was now beginning to shift. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. That afternoon, I received a call from Thomas, his voice calm as always, but carrying a subtle note of confirmation. "We have completed the preliminary updates," he said. "All relevant accounts now require dual authorization, and the notification protocols are active. If any attempt is made to access or reallocate funds beyond standard limits, you will be informed immediately." I thanked him, not with relief, but with understanding, because this was not about preventing something that might happen. It was about acknowledging something that very well could. After the call ended, I stood by the window in the living room, looking out at the quiet street, watching as a car passed slowly by, the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood continuing without interruption, unaware of the quiet recalibration taking place behind closed doors. It was late in the afternoon when my phone finally lit up again, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, and for a moment, I simply looked at it, not rushing to answer, not feeling the need to prepare myself. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Mom," he said, his tone measured, almost cautious, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar territory. "I got your message." I did not respond immediately. I allowed a small pause, not to create tension, but to give space for the weight of what needed to be said. "I assumed you would," I replied, my voice even, steady, unchanged. There was a brief silence on his end, the kind that suggests someone is choosing their next words carefully. "We have been busy," he continued, a slight edge of defensiveness slipping into his tone. "The wedding, the trip, everything has been a lot." I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear exactly how he chose to frame it. "I see," I said simply. Another pause followed, longer this time, and I could almost hear the unspoken expectation that I would fill it, that I would make this easier for him, that I would step into the familiar role of smoothing things over. But I did not. "You said there are things we need to review," he said finally, the words landing with a hint of impatience now. "What is this about?" I turned slightly, my gaze moving from the window to the photograph on the mantel, one of Daniel as a child, standing beside his father, both of them smiling, both of them unaware of how much would change over time. "It is about clarity," I said, my tone calm, but firm in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. "There are certain matters regarding the estate that require your attention." The shift on the other end of the line was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. The casual tone faded, replaced by something more focused, more alert. "Estate?" he repeated, as if the word itself carried more weight than he had expected. "What do you mean?" I let the silence settle again, just briefly, before answering. "I mean that there are structures in place that we need to go over together. In person." This time, there was no attempt to redirect the conversation, no dismissal, no casual deflection. "When?" he asked, his voice more direct now. "Tomorrow," I said. "At Thomas Reed's office. 10 in the morning." I did not ask if he was available. I did not offer alternatives. I simply stated the time and place, because for the first time in a very long time, I was not requesting his presence. I was expecting it. There was a short pause, and then he answered, "All right. I will be there." When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and stood there for a moment, the quiet of the house settling around me once again, but this time, it felt different. Something had shifted. Not in a way that could be seen from the outside, not yet, but in a way that was already setting the next part of this story into motion. And as I looked around the room, at the life I had built, at the pieces that had always belonged to me even when I allowed myself to forget that, I understood one thing with complete certainty. Tomorrow would not be a continuation of what had been. It would be the beginning of something else entirely. The next morning, I arrived at Thomas Reed's office 10 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, the kind of habit built over a lifetime of respecting time, of showing up prepared, of understanding that certain moments deserve a quiet sense of order. The receptionist greeted me with the same polite smile as before, and within minutes, I was seated in the familiar office, the folder already placed neatly on the desk, waiting. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my posture relaxed, my mind clear, not rehearsing what I would say, not anticipating how Daniel might respond, because for the first time, I did not need to control the outcome. I only needed to present the truth. When the door opened, I did not turn immediately. I heard his footsteps first, measured, slightly hesitant, and then he stepped into the room. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a tone I had not heard in a long time, something between uncertainty and caution. I looked up then, meeting his eyes calmly, taking in the details I might have once overlooked, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze moved briefly to the folder before returning to me. "Daniel," I replied, my voice steady, neither warm nor cold, simply present. He sat down across from me, adjusting his jacket slightly, as if trying to settle into a situation that did not feel entirely comfortable. "You said this was important," he began, his tone controlled, but edged with impatience, the same impatience I had heard on the phone the night before. "It is," I said simply, and then I turned the folder toward him, sliding it across the desk with a slow, deliberate motion. He glanced at Thomas briefly, then back at the papers, his brow tightening as he opened it, and began to read. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled, the kind that allows realization to take its time. I watched him as his expression shifted, subtly at first, then more clearly, the confidence he had carried into the room giving way to something else, something more alert, more aware. He turned a page, then another, his movements slower now, more careful, as if each line carried weight he had not expected. "What is this?" he asked finally, looking up, his voice no longer casual. "This," I said calmly, "is the structure your father put in place." He looked back down at the document, his eyes moving quickly now, searching, scanning, trying to piece together the full picture. "I thought everything transferred after," he began, but his sentence trailed off as he continued reading. Thomas spoke then, his tone measured and precise. "The estate is held within a trust, Daniel. Your father made very specific provisions regarding how and when access is granted. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the paper still in his hands, his posture no longer as controlled as it had been moments before. So what does that mean? He asked, his voice sharper now, not aggressive, but strained, as if he were trying to understand something that did not align with what he had assumed. I met his gaze steadily. It means that nothing moves without my approval, I said. It means that respect is not optional. It is required. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not raised, not emphasized, but clear in a way that did not invite interpretation. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing me from a distance he had not noticed before, as if trying to reconcile the person sitting across from him with the version of me he had grown used to. Is this about the wedding? He asked finally, his voice lower now, less certain. I held his gaze, not avoiding the question, but not rushing to answer it either. This is about everything, I said. The wedding was simply the moment that made it clear. He looked down again, the document still open in front of him, the silence stretching between us, but this time, it felt different, not empty, not uncomfortable, but necessary. I did not need to explain further. I did not need to justify anything. The truth was already there, written in ink, supported by structure, backed by intention that had been set long before either of us realized how important it would become. And as I sat there, watching him absorb it, I understood something with complete clarity. They had believed they could decide where I belong. They had believed they could close a door, and that would be the end of it. But what they had not understood, what they had never truly seen, was that the foundation beneath everything they were standing on had never been theirs to control. And now, for the first time, they were beginning to see that too.